At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations are surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an elevated, everyday home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. From September through the end of the year, we'll be exploring one of the most universal and unspoken subjects, death and dying. Very few of us know how to prepare for, talk about, and support others through end of life. In this 8-part series, I interview guests whose personal lives and professions are intimately tied to the subject. Join me in an exploration of how to find more peace in preparing for death. My guest today is expert facilitator Dan Bulf, who shares his experiences running death cafes, gatherings where people come together over coffee and cake to discuss topics related to death, dying, and mortality in a supportive and open environment. Dan is dedicated to raising people's consciousness and to inspiring action in their lives through rich, meaningful experiences. In addition to being a seasoned yoga teacher, he has produced dozens of podcasts and led numerous workshops, including the second Death Cafe held in the United States. Since that beginning in 2013, Dan has guided many conversations about death at hospitals, senior centers, senior living communities, and local organizations. Dan has contributed to studies on death perceptions and presented results at conferences. He mixes games, multimedia, laughter, and compassionate inquiry to direct people to a deeper understanding of themselves. It felt fitting to spend time with Dan as the last episode in our Death and Dying series, as Dan spends so much energy making a safe and open space for people to think and talk about death so that they can fully live their lives. At the end of the day, that is what the series has been aiming to do as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on with you.
Well, let's do it. We're going to spend today talking about death cafes, which I'm sure people have so many questions about. I think people tend to think they know what they are, but don't actually know what they are. So I'm really excited to dig in. Before I do that, I always like to ask my guests a little bit about what you were like as a child. Where did you grow up and what kind of kid were you?
Well, I grew up in the south side of Chicago, actually in the suburbs, not the south side of like Beverly, the Irish, filled with the Irish. South suburbs, the streets, the sidewalks rolled up at 9 p.m. It was a quiet little community, and I was a good boy. I was the good boy of the family. My brother had a lot of stuff going on, so I was his mirror image in a way, reflecting back like the good, positive kid, trying to do his best to keep the family peace.
Were you the older or younger?
I was the younger. Yeah, I was the younger. I was the youngest. I have a couple of steps as well. And so I was the younger, but I living with my brother and my mom, surprise child of the 70s, a child of divorce. And living with my mom, she was always struggling and hustling to make a living and make things work for us. I'm always grateful for my grandmother who lived with us. She actually moved in with my mom and my dad before I was even born. And she was really a rock for me. She was a steady presence. She was there when I came home at lunch and had SpaghettiOs with hot dogs ready for me at the table, or a bologna sandwich on the whitest of white bread. And then dinner too. And she was just always there as a really solid presence.
That is so special. I actually, in our society, you don't hear that story that much about a grandparent living with you, growing up with you. Can you share a couple things other than being there for meals that you remember about her presence being warm and sort of like a rock for you?
One of my earliest memories is sitting on her lap. I was probably 3 or 4. She would wrap her arms around me, interlace her fingers, and roll her thumbs. And I would take my index finger and try and poke in between, like, the little hole that's created. And I would try and poke and not get touched by the thumbs that were spinning around. And that was just, that warm embrace, that just light fun. And that's one of my earliest and probably my warmest memory of just being loved as a child. That was really amazing.
Is that a reason that you started working with death cafes? Or can you tell us about, I'm assuming, although I shouldn't assume, that your grandmother has passed?
My grandmother has passed, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And what was that experience like for you? Was that something that made you want to dig deeper into the subject matter?
No. Okay. No, it wasn't the stimulus creating the response. It was just part of the soup, I guess, as all these different influences came into my life. My mom passing, my dad passing, my brother passing, my stepbrother passing, all mixing together to create this awareness of death. And it's interesting. So, I mean, you said past.
Yeah.
And there's a great George Carlin skit that I like to bring sometimes into death cafes where he says, "Passed? What? Where they pass to? Did they pass a car? Did they pass gas?" And it's just, and I find it interesting how we use different language to try and. Well, why did you use the word past? Any idea?
Honestly, I didn't even think about it, which is interesting because I've been thinking a lot about death and dying in doing this series. I had a conversation with another guest whose parents both died by suicide. They said people say commit suicide, and that sounds like committing a crime. Right. So for them, it was really important to say they died by suicide. So I learned that in this series. And I've read books and talked to different people, but haven't really dug into died or passed or that language.
Part of that is realizing how we as a community and a culture will homogenize and sanitize how we talk about death. And in my judgment and what I've seen, that's not healthy. The challenge is, of course, we want to be sensitive to someone and the people who have had these traumas in their lives. I know it's important to be really honest and, healing that wound, there's going to be a scab and we've got to eventually get that scab off to let air onto it.
So do you think that it is healthier to say died rather than passed?
Yes,
okay.
I do. And it doesn't mean that it's not painful. To get healthy at something, you need to change. Change is hard, right?
Yeah.
Change, and just being, and it's also an acknowledgement of the pain that you're feeling. As someone has died in your life, I've lost them. Where are they now? Right? I'm going to my George Carlin again. I hope all your listeners are of an older age, because if you're 30 and under, George who?
Well, we do have the internet, so they can look up some videos. Okay, so it sounds like a number of people very close to you died. I don't know if it was in close proximity.
My dad, my mom, and my brother all died within 18 months of each other. That was a very challenging time. That was hard.
I would say so.
A lot of loss and... surprise, surprise, as family relationships can be. My relationships were not the best with my parents and my brother. My stepbrother came later. Starting with my mom, I went out to be in Seattle with her when she died. I hadn't seen her in probably 2 years. It was very healing for me and for her. I'm not going to say I think for her. No, it was for her. And I was there with my aunt as well. Just being with her in that time was very healing to make that final connection. Have you read the book, The Four Things That Matter by Dr. Beilock, Ira Beilock?
No, I haven't, but I will. At the end, I'm going to ask you for resources. We'll put them in the show notes. We're actually putting a compilation of all the books that have been recommended in this series together. I am glad to know of it.
It's a good one. And at the time, I wasn't even aware of this this work. And the four most important things are to say, I forgive you. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you.
Mm-hmm.
And she got to say all those things.
Yeah.
And so did I. My brother came out and we were around her bed in the hospital, and she started speaking to her biggest regret. It was, I wish I could have been a better mother. And it's like, oh, the truth and the poignancy and the pain and the realness still hits me today, 15, 20 years later. And just to redirect back to Death Cafe, that's the kind of story that people will share. And it's healing, get it off your chest to share and connect with other people. And whenever I share that story, I have people around me saying, I had a similar situation. So there's that connection and community that's created, and I am not alone.
Yeah.
That's a big part of what the Death Cafe is.
So let's go back to logistics. Like, where does a Death Cafe happen? How do you sign up for it? Could you find one? Can everybody find one in their community? Maybe let's start there.
Ashley, you could even run one. Anyone is invited to facilitate, to run a Death Cafe. They ask that you have some idea of how to facilitate a group, and it boils down to listening and holding space. There are ground rules that are set up. That's important to creating a safe space, a container for people to be in and share. Setting ground rules, confidentiality is a big one, especially in Death Cafe. It's sort of like Vegas rules, right? The idea is that you share your experience. Let's say, Ashley, you share your experience around someone in your life. I'm not going to go out and say, Ashley said this and this. What I'll do is I'll go out and say, one of the people in the group had this experience, and it really touched me because it made me connect to that softer part of myself that is wounded and fragile and vulnerable. I really appreciated that person sharing that. So I'm not going to tell your story. I'm going to tell my experience of the story. To me, that's what confidentiality is about in a safe container.
And how long does it last? Is it like
an hour? It's an hour and a half to 2 hours. They recommend 2 hours. It can vary. A lot depends on the size of the group. And if you have a big group, one time, the first Death Cafe I ran was 60 people.
Oh my goodness.
That was a big group.
Quite
large. It was really quite a dance as the facilitator. We did pairs. We did groups of 6. Each stage would be an opportunity to connect with someone and share what you were experiencing. It's like a pulse, a balloon, in and out, a breathing. The container has a life of its own, a breath. To allow that to expand and contract is a balloon, not let it pop, but also not let it completely deflate. Right. So that's a bit of philosophy around facilitation from my point of view. There's a website, deathcafe.com. You can go to, and they have a program manual that you can download and use. You can plan an event and upload it on their site. They recommend at least a month in advance to get the proper exposure. What I've done is just work from in the beginning, working Facebook. The last one I ran through a yoga studio that your loving sister is part of.
Yes.
So the yoga studio connected with their community, and we had 10 people attend.
Have you found there's a size that seems optimal for these experiences?
I personally like 10.
Okay.
10 to 12. Now, it's a little selfish because it allows me to actually connect with every person all the time. If we break up into pairs, I can still connect with people in their pairs.
Yeah.
A group of 60 was very challenging, and I partnered at that time, the first Death Cafe we ran with a woman named Vicky Noe. You should interview her. She's written a series of books on friend grief and how friendships, if a friend dies, it's discounted versus a family member. Yeah. But it can be just as impactful. And I remember we talked about that a bit, that first cafe. I like a little smaller group because it's more intimate. One time it was a conference. I had 500 people. We ran a little mini Death Cafe Phil Donahue. I had a remote mic and I'm running through the audience. And how did that make you feel? And who is this person? And running around. I really enjoyed that experience. It was fun. These can be fun. It's not all a drag.
Yeah.
Although
Well,
there are many tears.
of course. And, my whole goal in doing this series is that I think so few of us think or talk about death when it is the most inevitable thing in our lives. If we read about it, talk with people, think about it, plan for it, we can have more peace when it comes. And we don't know when it comes, right? We don't have the luxury of knowing that. I hope we can sort of remove the stigma from talking about it. And I think that's what you're doing.
Well, there's another important thing of the Death Cafe that made it really different than just a group getting together. You have coffee and tea and cakes and cookies. You sit down in a coffee shop. The first one I ran was in this coffee shop. We jammed all these people in there. But it's just so comfy. They have couches and little tables, making it a really accessible, relatable environment versus a hall or a classroom environment.
Right. Yeah. So when did you facilitate your first Death Cafe or attend your first Death Cafe? And how you had experienced a lot of loss within an 18-month period. Was it shortly after that?
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
No. This happened before, but the deaths were not. The deaths were really not a stimulus to be interested in the Death Cafe. What I've just always been interested and excited to create environments where people can share and learn and connect and grow. That's my mission. I run a lot of men's groups in the area, and that's something very meaningful to me. The Death Cafes came along. I was running men's groups. I was running father and son weekend. I was a certified fatherhood facilitator, and I was really enjoying that. And then someone from my kids' grade school came up to me, Vicky, who I mentioned earlier, Vicky Noe, and said, Dan, I know you're into these really interesting workshops and experiential stuff, and I've got this thing for you. It's called the Death Cafe. And I said, oh, it's for people who can't hear. Right. I heard what I thought was appropriate. Oh, for people who can't hear. And she said, no, Death Cafe. And I said, wait, what? And she said, yeah, this thing started in England. John Underwood and his mom, Susan, started this, and they had their first group experience of drinking coffee and sitting around talking about death and dying and life, legacy. And that's another key component to a Death Cafe. It's important as a facilitator to me and to the Death Cafe people. You don't get stuck in death. Death is the platform to understand how you are living and how you choose to leave a legacy.
Yeah, agree. Yeah.
So Vicky said, let's do this. I'm like, yeah, all right. We found the place and got a bunch of people together. It went wild on Facebook. We were the second people to do it in the United States.
Really?
Lizzie Miles was the first person to hold a Death Cafe in the United States a week earlier in Columbus, Ohio. That was back
1 week.
2000. Yeah, I think that was 2012. Yeah, I know, 1 week. So Lizzie Miles led one, then we led one, and now years later, so first one was 2011, the Death Cafe, official Death Cafe, and over 50,000 people have attended, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. They call it a social franchise, which to me just means it's grassroots. Anyone can run one. Anyone can show up. And it's pretty amazing, the viral potential for this. And even, to go to 50,000 and thousands of locations. Shanghai had one.
Yeah. Do people come multiple times or do they come once? How does it tell us about that?
Yes, that's an interesting one. As I was reflecting on my Death Cafe experiences, there's some Death Cafe people who are kind of like junkies.
Yeah.
My good friend Lydia was a junkie, and she would come to many of them. She's a therapist and loved the energy, the honesty, the vulnerability. And for herself, her processes, going through her experiences, she really enjoyed the experiences. And I co-hosted with her several times up in Lake Forest. She was so passionate about it. And she got a specialization in her counseling practice. She's a grief counselor.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That is wonderful. Okay, so how frequently do you hold them?
So I had been holding them once a month. I did that for about a year. And the energy seemed to be petering out. It was a lot of time and effort, and it was a part of my business of creating experiences. And it just wasn't, I was running about once a month. I was having 3, 4, 5 people. Eventually I needed to move on. So there was a time, probably a 3 or 4 year time frame where I didn't run a Death Cafe. The last year, inspired by Lisa, who owns the Heaven Meets Earth yoga studio in Evanston, she's like, Dan, you've got to run one. You would be so great at it. I said, I'm pretty good. It's meaningful. So I did. And we had 10 people come out. My intention is to continue running them now. I've gotten back into it. And for me, and this is part of Death Cafe's format, is that it's nonprofit. You can ask for donations, but it only to support the coffee, cake, and tea and cookies.
Okay.
And potentially the venue.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a big part.
And I assume we've talked a little about what people get out of it. I want to talk about what you get out of it. It sounds like you're good at facilitating, whether it's for fatherhood or men's groups. It doesn't have to be about death necessarily. Is there something specific you get out of doing this continuously that helps you think about death, think about life, or process information? Or is it just connecting to other people? All of the above?
All of it. A big part of it is my goal, my mission, and working towards fulfilling my mission. Of course, mission is really never achieved. It's always out there, working something always to work towards more. And I have to tell you, of all the formats that I facilitate, men's work and fatherhood, now, and the Death Cafe is by far the deepest people go. And I love that about the Death Cafes. People will think I'm crazy at the end of this. It's so much fun planning these for me. Now, a Death Cafe typical format is you put a question out there and let it evolve. I like to create a stimulus and then offer up the responses. One of my sessions was focused completely on Forrest Gump. We took little segments of Forrest Gump, so when Bubba died.
Right.
When Mama died.
Yeah.
When Jenny died.
Mm-hmm.
And I created a context around that. So when Bubba died, a friend died. When your parent dies, when it wasn't his spouse, but it was his spouse. That's right. When your spouse dies. So when Bubba died, it was about how do we respond to death. When Mama died, I created a conversation on how do we choose to live. And when Jenny died, the conversation was about legacy. If you remember towards the end of the movie, their son put a letter he'd written on her grave. And so the process I created was, what would you write in that letter? And we actually did that. Some people didn't want to share, but most shared. I like to hang a string of twine across the room and have paper clips and allow people to step up, read their letter, and hang it on the line at the end of the process to see everyone's legacies strung across. It's a beautiful beautiful experience. And I'm just so happy to be a witness and in some way facilitate the process.
I mean, that's so beautiful. One of the people that I spoke with in the series, her name is Susan Turnbull, and she works specifically on legacy. She calls them ethical wills, and that term actually comes from Judaism. She's not Jewish, but it's just intentional communications. And her entire practice is focused on helping people create these intentional communications. For some people, it's very long. And for some people, it's bullet points. Her point is just get started. And it doesn't have to be long. It can be a lifelong endeavor. You can add to it over time. Things change. And it sounds like you have some of that in some of your sessions, but that each session is different.
I try and make each session different. And I have a couple of gambits or processes that I try and put in every session. One of which is in the very beginning. I have an emotion wheel, and it's like a pie, and each pie is a different emotion. So anger, sadness, shame, neutral. I always put other too, and as you walk in, and the big question is, how do you feel about death?
You got to have fear in there.
Right. Fear is in there for sure. I think I should change the proportions. That should be at least a quarter of the
yeah.
And people, and I give people a little sticker and they stick it on and they talk with each other a little bit about that. And that's the first question when you come in and sit down. I pull that poster in and I said, okay, let's talk about this. So we say your name and how do you feel about death and where's that coming from?
Yeah.
And that's the invitation to bring in someone you love who has died.
Yeah.
That's the opening.
So there's deathcafe.com, so people can learn about it through that site, or if their yoga studio or something happens to be encouraging this. How are people finding out about them and then deciding to go? See, there are some people who think, I don't need it, or it's not for me, or I haven't lost somebody, but we're all going to die and we're all going to lose somebody that we love. Or somebody that we love will die. I'm going to try to get better at this.
What's the mortality rate for humans?
100%. So, but I think one of the biggest things, and I don't know, I mean, you have people self-selecting to attend, but one of the biggest things is just denial, right? That we don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it. So I'm just interested in how these people find you, and do they share that with you? And then maybe maybe it's a little bit word of mouth, like somebody goes and then they tell a friend, you should really do this, but it's not that prevalent yet,
So Death Cafe is extremely viral, word of mouth. You'll see stuff pop up on Facebook if you happen to be friends with someone who's running one. That's a big part of showing up. But there are a lot of other formats out there too. Have you heard about Death Over Dinner?
No.
So Death Over Dinner is another format from a professor out in Washington, Michael Hebb. Similar format to Death Cafe, but more rigid. He has a whole process outlined. Get some friends together for dinner. Have wine. Eat. And then poems are read. And he has a response to them. Music is played. There's another way. There's a lot of different ways to connect to the reality of death in a safe, comfortable way with friends and people who care. And that's the critical piece to this. You need to feel comfortable. Sometimes, and I think the Death Cafe is great for this, it's a group of strangers. People feel safer for this discussion among strangers. I will always invite couples, whether it's like mother-daughter or husband-wife, to separate in the conversations. And that enables them to be freer with what they say. There's a worry about it's going to come back to them. And they want that confidentiality, that privacy piece. It's just going back to couples and people coming in and not coming in. There was one couple that came in, the wife walked in, she was so excited. Oh, this is going to be so great. I need and I want to talk about death and dying. And she had her husband. Her husband didn't say a word. They sat down. And we went through the first process, and I come to him. So what was your button? I'm an atheist. I don't, this is just all, he actually said bullshit. Can I swear? I'm channeling my dad there too, I think. It's all bullshit. And I said, that is so great. Tell us more about your perspective on how this is all bullshit. And then he wouldn't stop talking. It was just, that might have been my most brilliant facilitation moment. That's great. Tell me more.
Yeah.
And it's for everybody. It just takes the courage. And I mean, it's painful. Courage to step in.
Do you find that people come with an agenda like, I want to process this, or I'm focused on that, or is it more general?
It's definitely more general. People walk in and they're carrying their weight. They've got their burden. They've got their grief with them for sure. But to be clear, death cafes are not grief counseling.
Right.
That's so important because I had, related to this question you're asking, I had, one time I had a woman walk into a senior center and, ground rule, one of the ground rules, this is not grief counseling. You can have some expression of grief.
Yeah.
But I can't process this. I'm just a guy to hold the group together. And she got so mad. What are you talking about? That my daughter died. And say, oh, my daughter died 3 years ago, and I just need help, and I can't get over this. I felt for her, and I was really glad she made it through. I hope that she found some peace from the experience. At the end, she didn't storm off.
She stayed.
And participated. And so I just bless her on her journey. She loved her daughter so much that she just had to hold on. She couldn't take the loss. And
I think that is a very common experience. Mm-hmm. So if it's not grief counseling, it is, I think this is what I wrote down, and you can tell me if this is correct, is that it is to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most out of their lives.
Yes.
Okay.
That's like, that's to me the perfect. And it also reflects all over my personal life, whether it's men's groups or whatever. Just get real. So awareness is the first piece. When we jump ahead to a note you had sent me, had talked about death positivity.
Yeah. So
for so many people, that's not a jump, that's a leap, right? Like you're going off the edge.
Right.
And if I can, my goal and what I want is just, we can just, as a group, and I maybe can help lead this, a little piece of new awareness around how this is showing up in our lives. That can lead then to healing, to forgiveness, to gratitude. Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, the ultimate expression of a life process is ending in gratitude. Even through all the trauma and terrible incidents and whatever we experience, if we can come to that. And I think that just about every major religion comes to that end of gratitude. Nirvana, consciousness.
Yeah, which is a more uncomfortable place to sit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a more meaningful one. So you are always coming up with the agenda. Can participants ever request a subject or a topic, or does that not happen? It's never happened.
And I have to, you saying it to me out loud. Yeah, let's do this. I love the creativity. I love it. Let's build something. And start with the end in mind. What do you want to have happen at the end of this experience?
Yeah.
So I ran, they weren't death cafes. The death cafe model evolved for me as I was trying to make a livelihood out of this facilitated and creative experience. And two things happened. that come to mind when you phrase that. One is that I became involved in a research project on death awareness and how it impacts people's lives. And does it have a positive impact? I'm blanking out on the term. Is it evidence-based that it will create positive outcomes? There we go.
Okay.
And that was through the University of Missouri. Hat tip here to Jackie Benson. She'll probably be listening to this. Jackie Benson was the associate professor who ran this research project, and it was very similar to a death cafe. And at the end, people were found to have a higher quality of life than the control group, which didn't experience the death cafe. So
that doesn't surprise me. Was that research published? Do you know?
No, because there wasn't enough peer review.
Okay.
And it was also extremely small sampling.
Is it something
you'll be surprised to hear it was hard to find people to attend. Let's talk about death.
Yeah. Is it something that, do you think that she's working on to try to get a larger sample size or more peer? Like, I think if you could do that research on a bigger scale and get it in a peer-reviewed journal, that would actually be really amazing. That
was her goal. And it was close, and she ended up changing jobs, and it was, and it's unfortunate. It didn't gain the momentum it needed to get to that place where it was actually shared. Yeah. You understand the language better than I. I was there just to make it like the engine trying to make it happen.
Well,
that was very so she came to me after she was a death cafe junkie. Okay. And she came to me and she said, I would like to do a research project on this to see if this experience has positive outcomes.
Yeah.
And together we designed in a very specific format.
Right.
So that was one. And the other one that was really interesting, it was so funny because it just to reflect back on everything I've done, I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool. I associated with an association, a medical association in Illinois, and they hired me, and I went to different hospitals and performed death cafes for medical residents. All based and the specific idea was how can we leverage Atul Gawande's Being Mortal's book.
Yeah,
and the work
it's a wonderful book.
Make sure you get that resource in there. He's fantastic.
It's a wonderful
I would
book.
love him. I'd love to have a death over dinner with him.
Yeah.
And just talk to these medical residents about how do you death for them, what does it mean, and also helping people through the dying process and the challenge of telling someone that they're going to die sooner than later. Mm-hmm. So one of my biggest aha moments was I remember it was in East St. Louis, and it was a group of 40 people. It was residents and also their, I guess it's attendees. And I got everyone to stand up, and we created a line, a fear line. So a 5 was you are terrified of death, and a 0 is you have no fear of death. Mm-hmm. And just line yourself up. Where do you fall on that spectrum? And of course, they all huddled over by number 5. And as we began then to talk about, well, what is it like to have this experience of these people around you being in the same space as you? And my impression was they would be very stoic and emotionless, very cut and dry. And no, tears, empathy, vulnerability. My view of the medical field really transformed from that experience. And even when I have an experience with a doctor where they seem to be very together and controlled, my sense is that underneath that all, they're definitely having their experience of fear and around death, around dying.
I feel like having, whether it's death cafes or death over dinner, all residents should participate in that, because I feel like it's part of the medical profession that's not taught, and it's so important.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. They were all like, oh my gosh, thank you for being here.
Yeah. Right. And then they have to, if they're not given the tools, they have to do the best they can in the situations where they have to tell somebody that they're going to die, or they have to tell a family member that somebody died. And, we should give them the tools so that they can be more empathetic in the moment, and also so that they can process it themselves, because it's a lot for them to process.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to ask you.
Yeah.
0 to 5. So you've had all these podcasts now that you've done around death and dying, and of course your own personal experiences. Where do you fall now? Oh no, I want to shift my question.
Okay.
Before your D&D series, and now here towards the end.
Okay, I would say I was hovering around a 5 before, and I would say I'm probably at a 2.5 or 3 now. So I feel a lot more peace. I also have made some plans for myself. So I did an episode with a company called Recompose that's based in Washington State. They do human composting, and you basically become like a flatbed of nutrient-rich soil. So your last act in life is giving life to the earth. So I've decided I want to do that. I had that discussion with my husband. So I've actually had conversations with other loved ones about what they want at the end of life. And I feel like the reading that I've done and the conversations that I've had have enabled me to do that. And also to have this sense that what I can do is focus on how I'm living and what I want in the end, what I want and what I don't want as the end nears, if I'm in a situation where it's not, an accident or something that's, immediate, and to hopefully, and I still have work to do, but on my ethical wills and, some of these things, but to plan so that when I die, it's easier for those I leave behind. Because I think that's another thing that we don't do well. Like when we are in denial about death, we don't plan for it, it makes it much harder for the people who are still alive when we die. And I think one of the greatest gifts we can give them is to do that planning ahead of time so that they can just implement our wishes. They don't have to guess at what our wishes are. And that, trivial things like passwords and, those kinds of things, all the way to the very important things like the intentional communications, and all of that is very meaningful. So I think it's a road. Where are you on that scale now, do you think?
So I acknowledge in my life that it's definitely variable. It's back and forth. Right now, I'm feeling like a 2. Mm-hmm. I'm feeling emboldened. I'm feeling far more ready.
Yeah.
And I have a sense that when the time comes, it's kind of tidal, where I will be awash with fear, and then I'll reground myself and be present and be at a 3.
Yeah.
Right. And that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is scary.
Yeah.
What's next? Is anything next? Is this it? Is this
right?
And that, sure, it could be scary, but how do I want to show up at the end? I want to be courageous. And so this is, I want to, before we move too far forward, the best process for these death cafes that I've run, that people love, 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 go wish cards. Go wish. All right. So it's there's an organization. They make these decks of cards, 36 cards. Each card has a different want as you're dying. One can be surrounded by clergy. One card is surrounded by clergy. One is not to be a financial burden. One is to be kept clean. Mm-hmm. Did you ever think of that, to be kept clean? I just never thought of it. And there it was. I'm like, oh yeah, that would be good.
Yeah. So
there's all these cards, 36 cards, and everybody gets a deck of cards and you sort them. what's important, what's kind of meh, and then just, what's not important. So for me, and then we look at, once we get that done, I say, okay, what patterns do you see? And for me, I found that anything religious was definitely something I was not so interested in. I don't want a priest around me. And then what are the patterns in the positive side? In the positive side, then so for me, what definitely is showing up is I don't want to have pain, and I want to be family and no pain.
Yeah.
That was showing up for me.
Yeah. So
go wish, and then cards. And then this is the final piece, and it's so funny. People like, are you kidding me, Dan? So you take your pile of the things that are important to you, and you pick one. What's the most important thing? Just pick one. And I have to say this every time. It's so funny. And this is not legally binding. You can change your mind. But if you had to pick one, what would it be? And it's people love it.
Okay. That sounds like another wonderful resource. The other thing that I'm thinking as you're talking is that there's no reason you couldn't do like a death over dinner with family.
You made me twitch when you said that. I went to a 5. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. My urging would be to find a third party person to facilitate.
Yeah.
Every family's different. Some families may be far more available and open and ready for stuff, for the hot topics like this.
Yeah.
But if you sense if there might be friction, I would definitely invite you to get a facilitator. But yeah, for sure.
Although I remember you were saying something that might be magical about the Death Cafe is that it's strangers and it gives people a freedom. But it's just, I don't know. I was just thinking about it as we were talking.
Yeah. Do you need me to come out and facilitate for you?
Although I'm not sure, I could perhaps do it myself.
Yes,
if I do a little bit of work.
Well, a lot of it is about the energy and the relationships. I mean, if you have two people who are butting heads, it might not be great.
Right, of course. I was actually thinking a better place to start would be to have like a small group of friends, but obviously they know what they're coming for, like it's a prize. But I think that could be just super interesting and extremely meaningful. And sometimes I think people need just a little push to get into these more difficult conversations. And once they're there, they're in, kind of like that gentleman you were telling us about who kind of came begrudgingly and then ended up talking the whole time. So I think sometimes so people have to seek you out. If I invited a group of 10 friends to my home, they could say yes or no, but they would think about it if they perhaps otherwise wouldn't think about participating in something like that.
Right? Yeah.
Which I think is cool.
You would probably, I don't know, depending on your friends, you might have to give them a little poke. Come on. It's not going to be so bad. Listen to Dan. He's kind of funny.
And it's facilitated. You don't have to come up with the questions. You just have to participate, which is easier than coming up with it yourself.
Oh, you know what just hit me though is just, and this is a facilitator for this sort of experience in particular. It's so someone is having an emotional experience, is just falling into a place of grief. My challenge is to allow them to have that space, to be in that space and be a witness to the beauty of that and to move on.
Yeah.
Because we can't spend 15 minutes, half an hour.
How do you do that?
It's hard. How do I do it? First off, it's very intuitive. I don't like your question. Ask me another question. So part of it is looking at the rest of the group. Are they engaged? In which case, it's a benefit to everybody. Mm-hmm. Also, it's intuitive. Just to say, okay, now it's important to be sensitive to saying, I see you, I understand your grief, and it's important at this time that we allow other people to share.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you, and it's a question, can you come back and be with us as a participant?
Yeah. Yeah. Have you focused as a topic in any of your death cafes, or have you found that participants come with a focus on anticipatory grief? So somebody is sick but hasn't died, and they're processing that.
I've been fortunate to facilitate several different sort of like age ranges.
Okay.
So I've gone into retirement communities and assisted living facilities, and I've gone and we've had more a general, like at coffee shops, and that's where people, I'm going to assume what your age is. I won't say it out loud, but
I don't mind.
Your parents, but parents are now aging and coming to the point of dying.
Yeah.
And then there's the parents who are dying. So there's, oh my gosh. So the question was that anticipation. There's anticipation all over. There's the people who are in their 80s who are worried about their children experiencing their death. There are the children who are worried about experiencing their parents' death. And then I was also, I ran a couple of classes at Northwestern for freshmen. It was a humanities class. And what that was like. And I was surprised because these 19-year-olds were very similar to parents in their answers and their responses. Most people show up, they're worried, their parents have recently passed or they're getting there and they're trying to process that. So every time I've gone into a retirement community or the assisted living, it's like, it's the Friday night party. They've got the wine out. They're like, thank God you're here. I need to talk about this and I can't with my kids.
Interesting.
Right? It was very interesting.
So do you have a sort of a standout story or experience that you can think of, obviously without names, but that occurred in any of your death cafes?
I was thinking about one of the Northwestern classes that I taught.
I am really interested in that because, okay, freshmen in college, they may have experienced they very likely have experienced a grandparent's passing or death. And it's obviously quite possible they've experienced death of either a parent or another friend or loved one. But, what we hear about that age group is that they feel like they're going to live forever, that, so in that sense, you would think that they aren't thinking deeply about death and they aren't as able to sort of go deep there. But it sounds like perhaps they were.
They went deep. This is the story that came to mind about that experience. The second, I taught twice, 2 semesters in a row. I taught one class, a young woman her mother had just died, like a week before. And this was her first time back in class. And the regular professor came up and told me this, I was in awe of her being able to be there.
Yeah.
And she found her edge and she had to leave. And then we as a class talked about that.
Yeah.
And I know the professor said she was going to absolutely be checking in with her because it was so raw, raw.
Of course.
And I just marvel at that. Here's this, 19-year-old, and knowing they all knew what the class was.
Yeah.
And she could have absolutely gotten a free pass.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
And she showed up and she was her best self.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about death cafes that you would like people to know?
Go. Take the risk. Leap. A skillful facilitator will allow you to really open up and create a new awareness around death and dying for you.
Yeah.
Don't make it about death. That's just the outside cover of the book of your life. Make it about the book. Mm-hmm. And those, you can, if you choose to focus in on those last few pages of how you want your dying process to look, that's wonderful. If you want to focus in on the guts of the book and appreciating that and how you've shown up and how it's your legacy, what you leave behind.
So people go to deathcafe.com and they can find a death cafe near them. Or if they want to learn how to facilitate themselves, is there information on the website about how to do that?
No.
Okay.
There are a few bullet points on that. I love facilitating, and it just really brings life to me.
Yeah.
It fills me up. And so I've taken a lot of trainings and courses on that. But there are some bullet points. And for Death Cafe, it's not rocket science. It's listening, it's allowing, and it's being vulnerable.
Yeah. So if you are at a 2 to 3, I think you said on the fear of death scale right now, when you started the death cafes, were you more like a 5? Like, do you think that it has shifted you down?
I was not on the scale. I was like, oblivious.
So far above it?
I was not I don't know, above it, below it, not around it. Okay. I'm 60 now, about to be 60. So I was probably 45. I had young kids. I'm invincible. And Vicky came to me, Death Cafe. Oh yeah, here, what? And it was, so at the time, it was just even, there was no scale. And now just reflecting back, I was probably a 3 or 4. I'd been doing a lot of personal work still at the time, especially through men's communities. I was becoming more and more in touch with who I am and in my mission and what I want to give back. I take about another 10 minutes to think about that.
Yes, for sure. We can come back to it. I have questions I like to ask every guest.
Okay.
So let's go through those questions and then you can come back. And if you want to add anything else, we'll do that at the end. Okay, so my first question...
Wait, I didn't have my seatbelt on. It's coming. Okay.
My first question is, as we explore in my brand, which is called Amatand, which means to take care of your soul, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us. They can take us to the past, enable us to live in the present more, or even take us into the future. Can you share an object from your life, whether you still have it or not, that holds a lot of meaning for you, and tell us why?
I have a small altar.
Yeah.
And these are people that have been in my life and that have died, except 2 recent additions. So here, these are little portraits that my son drew of me and my wife.
Wow, those are beautiful.
Yeah, they're really nice, right? He's extremely talented.
Wow.
And then here's one he did of my dad.
Aww.
When my dad was suffering, he was in a very bad state of dementia, Alzheimer's at this time. And so, I love this so much. So I have this up here, and then I have a picture of my mom. There's my grandma, my mom and grandma. My
so lovely.
His grandma was suffering from cancer, and I look at that, and it's a wig she was wearing, and she was out with her pearls.
Yeah, she sure was.
And then this is a flower from my mother-in-law's funeral.
Oh.
Bless you, Peggy. All right. Here we go. This is my dad.
All right. Okay.
He's in a baggie.
All right.
Oh, you want to hear funny? This is a good story. I have to share this about my dad.
Okay.
My dad was born in Italy, born in Rome.
Okay.
Grew up in a suburb, and his family has a mausoleum, the Bulf,
Okay.
Familia Bulf Mausoleum in Manziana, just outside Rome. My dad died, and I just wanted to take some of his ashes and put it in the mausoleum. So Liz and I, my wife Liz and I, we go out to Italy. We're taking this trip, and we're going to go to Italy, and we're going to bring his ashes to the mausoleum. So if we get the mausoleum, and we didn't, who's going to? There's no one there. we find it, and it has a glass front, and there are air holes in the glass. There was a ladder down the corridor. I went and got the ladder. I stepped up on the ladder, and I slid the plastic baggie with a note of my dad. Oh my God, am I going to get arrested for this? Slid the plastic baggie of my dad down the hole, and it plopped down at the bottom. Fortunately, the plastic bag held. And with a note that said, "This is Valio Bulf. Please keep him here."
Oh my goodness. So now you're going to have to go back and see if it's still there.
I know, right? And this is I like this. This is a 1 year sober chip.
Very cool.
So now there's other stuff, but whatever. Yeah, you get it.
That's beautiful. You have an altar to all of these people in your life that have died, and it's both photographs and objects. I love it. Can you share a favorite tradition? It could be something from when you were a child or something you do with your family or your wife today, anything at all, and let us know why you chose it.
Oh, favorite tradition. Oh my goodness. So Christmas, my wife's family, it comes from a big family, and we have this wonderful tradition of, it's like a whole week-long thing. Of 7 siblings, 1 left, went to Boston, and she and her family would come in. And Christmas Eve, we'd be together, and then Christmas Day, we'd have breakfast. I'm sad because that's changing now that the youngsters are now having their own lives.
Right.
So this Christmas, and now we've taken to trying to get everyone together down in Florida to spend Christmas down there. And that's really wonderful. It's a new tradition.
It sounds like a great topic for an upcoming Death Cafe to talk about the way that our traditions and our lives change with the seasons of our lives. Are you in a phase in your life where you enjoy entertaining in your home? Why or why not?
Oh, old man Dan is cropping up with that. What always comes up, I don't want to clean the dishes. Our roles are Liz does the cooking, and then I clean up, and but I love entertaining at home. It's cozy. We have this cute little house. So I do love to entertain, especially with the right people.
Yeah. Well, one of the tips that I've heard, and I'm always interested in this because I do feel like we have seasons in our life where we want to welcome people into our home and where we're less available to do that for whatever the reason. One of the tips was to have people help. It was a woman who lives in the South, and she said one of the things moving to the South that was so wonderful is like it's more potluck. So people bring things and then they stay and they help you clean, and you let them help you clean. And think about how many times people say, I help with that. And you say, oh no, it's okay. Mm-hmm. What if you said, great, let's do it. Maybe you would.
What's the expression about twice as many hands?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And then it becomes actually an experience. It becomes part of the evening. So maybe you could try that. Okay. We already talked about some top resources, and we will put those in the show notes. But if there are any other books or podcasts or anything that you recommend, and they don't have to be related to death cafes. It could be just any favorites that you have. Love to hear them.
So Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, awesome. He's such a beautiful writer. He writes for the New York Times as well, and he's amazing. What are some of my other good ones? Ira Beilock. There's a TED Talk that I really love that I've used in sessions. It's called The 4 Stories We Tell Ourselves About Death. By Stephen Case, the 4 stories we tell each other about death. And so I won't tell you what they are because I want you to listen.
Okay.
But that's fertile soil to grow your awareness and where you're showing up. I just love TED Talks. There's so many amazing people in there.
And what were those cards called?
Go Wish. Oh my
Go
gosh.
Wish.
It makes things so much easier. I tell people, I give them away. If someone comes and says, these cards are so great, I wish I could talk to my parents like this. Here's a set.
Wonderful. Okay, last question. And you may have already answered this with what you're doing with the Death Cafes, but what do you do for yourself? Do you have a practice, a habit, or a daily routine that contributes to your success or your well-being?
Well, so among my many other things, I'm a yoga instructor.
Okay.
Which is really a grounding for me and fun and fulfilling. Makes me really living a mission. I have a meditation practice that, again, grounds me, eases me. My meditation practice is more about just being at ease.
Yeah. So do you practice yoga and meditation every day?
Probably yoga. I teach 3 days a week. I practice 3 days a week. I meditate almost every morning. 10 minutes in the morning when I wake up, I'll sit down and I'm a big fan of YouTube and they have wonderful videos on there.
Okay. Wonderful.
Tara Brach. She rocks. Tara Brach.
Okay. We'll check it out. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been so wonderful talking with you. And we will put all of the things we've talked about in the show notes.
Thank you for trusting me. I hope this met your expectations and more, and I appreciate you bringing awareness to death and dying.
Well, thank you for doing what you're doing. It's amazing, and you're doing it because you want to do it. And, there aren't a lot of people doing that these days. Really quite special and wonderful. And I've certainly learned a lot. And I have some resources that I'm going to be following up on. And who knows, I might even try my own Death Cafe here in Park City, Utah.
Excellent. I'll be there. No, I'll try.
Right.
I'll start walking now.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, you can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatand, which you can find at amatand.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Amatand. And you can learn more about products related to the Death and Dying series at amatand.com. Thanks for listening.